Around 250 BC, a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii settled on a small island in the middle of the Seine River. The island we call Île de la Cité today. Water embraced it from every direction, and that water meant everything. Natural security, abundant fish, and trade routes flowing right past their doorstep. The Parisii were sharp, practical people. They knew exactly where to build a home. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Alps with his legions and conquered Gaul with ruthless efficiency. The Parisii resisted, but against the Roman war machine, resistance was never going to be enough. Rome took the island and built a city they called Lutetia, a name some believe comes from a Latin root meaning swamp or muddy water. Perhaps the Romans weren't thrilled about the river, but they had no choice. And yet the Romans were more than conquerors, they were builders. On the hills south of the river, in what is now the Latin Quarter, they raised a real city. Public baths, stone-paved roads, an aqueduct stretching 30 kilometers to bring in fresh water. Lutetia was every inch a Roman city, with all its grandeur and order. Its population swelled to 8 or 10,000 souls, a remarkable number for its time. For 3 centuries the Romans lived here, 3 centuries during which the city grew. Cultures blended and the Parisii slowly became Gallo-Romans. But history never stops blowing its winds, and empires are never eternal. In the 3rd century AD, Germanic tribes pressed from the north. The city shrank, people abandoned the southern hills, and retreated to the safety of the island. Lutetia was becoming something else. In the late 3rd century, a man came from Italy to Lutetia. His name was Dionysius, a Christian bishop who wanted to bring the new faith to the people of Gaul. But Rome's governors feared this upstart religion. They arrested Dionysius, and on a hill now called Montmartre, they cut off his head. But the story didn't end there. Legend says that after his beheading, Dionysius picked up his own head, walked several kilometers on his own 2 feet, and fell at the exact spot where he wished to be buried. Whether myth or miracle, this story reveals the extraordinary power Christianity had seized in people's hearts. Dionysius became Saint Denis, the first martyr of Paris, and a great cathedral was built in his name, which would later become the burial place of the kings of France. The 5th century was a century of terror. Attila, king of the Huns, descended from the east with hundreds of thousands of warriors. Cities fell in his path, one after another, turned to ash and ruin. When word reached Lutetia that Attila was marching their way, the people of the city were seized with panic. Everyone wanted to run, but a young woman stood in the way of that flight. Her name was Genevieve. She called the people to prayer and resistance. She told them the city would be saved. The people stayed. And somehow, in a way historians still debate, Attila changed course and never attacked Paris. Perhaps it was the prayers. Genevieve became a hero, later a saint. Today the Pantheon stands over her grave. Paris still calls her the patron of the city. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, a power vacuum opened across Europe. The Franks stepped in to fill it. Clovis I, king of the Franks, declared Paris the capital of his kingdom in 508 AD, a moment that was a true turning point in the city's story. From that day forward, Paris would grow not as a Roman fort, but as the heart of a kingdom. The name Lutetia quietly faded. People began speaking of Paris, a name taken from that original tribe on the island, the Parisii. Keeping the name of the first people who had chosen this place was a kind of homage, a thread of memory stretching back to the very beginning. But the Frankish era was far from peaceful. Civil wars, the kingdom carved up among sons, weakness at the center, all of it left the city vulnerable. And from the north came seafarers whose very name made all of Europe tremble. 885 AD, hundreds of Viking longships sailed up the Seine. 30 to 40,000 Scandinavian warriors arrived at Paris. The city had only a few hundred fighters. The siege began. For a full year, the people of Paris were trapped on their island. But Paris did not surrender. Count Odo organized a heroic defense. 2 defensive towers had been built on the bridges, and the Vikings could not break through. Finally, King Charles the Fat arrived with his army, and instead of fighting, he paid the Vikings off and sent them toward other lands. This naked betrayal of Paris and its brave defenders enraged the people. Odo, the hero of the defense, rose to become king. The lesson was clear. Paris could survive on its own, with or without any central authority. From the 11th century onward, Paris grew at a feverish pace. Philip II, called Philip Augustus, drew a massive wall around the city in the late 12th century. That wall declared to the world, Paris is no longer just a city, it is a capital, a center of power. In those same years, one of the most breathtaking buildings in human history began to rise. In 1163, construction started on the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The medieval architects wanted to build something that felt like heaven on earth. Soaring columns, rainbow-colored windows, vaulted arches reaching toward the sky. Generations came and went, but the cathedral kept climbing. Notre Dame became the spiritual heart of Paris. The University of Paris took shape in those same centuries. In the late 12th century, scholars and teachers gathered in the Latin Quarter, a neighborhood named for the Latin tongue that was the language of learning. Students arrived from across all of Europe. The Sorbonne became one of the greatest centers of knowledge in the world. If you wanted to study philosophy or theology in the Middle Ages, Paris was where you went. The 14th and 15th centuries were centuries of agony. The Black Death reached Paris. Within a decade, a third to half of Europe's population was gone. The streets of Paris were filled with the dead. People did not know what this plague was. Was it the apocalypse? Was God punishing them? After the plague came war. The English claimed the French throne. The 100 Years' War began. France was tearing apart at the seams. Paris changed hands multiple times. In 1420, the English took the city and held it, but in that darkness, a star blazed into view. A peasant girl from Lorraine, Joan of Arc. She said she heard the voice of God commanding her to save France. In 1429, clad in armor, banner in hand, she led an army and broke the English siege of Orléans. That victory breathed life back into the soul of France. The English were driven out. Paris became French again. Joan was burned at the stake, but her name became immortal. The 16th century was the age of the Renaissance. New ideas poured in from Italy. The kings of France fell in love with art. Francis I invited Leonardo da Vinci himself to come to France. Leonardo came and brought with him certain works, including a painting said to depict an Italian noblewoman. That painting would later be called the Mona Lisa, and it found its home in the Louvre. The Louvre has its own epic story. It began as a military fortress in the 12th century, guarding the western approach to the city. Gradually, it became a royal palace. Kings expanded it, beautified it, and filled it with art. Today, the Louvre is the largest art museum in the world. Its corridors stretch for kilometers. If you were to stand for just 1 minute before each of its artworks, you would need years. This city, this Paris, does not just build monuments. It keeps the memory of humanity itself. 1789. Paris was on the verge of explosion. People were hungry. Bread had become too expensive for ordinary families. King Louis XVI lived in the Palace of Versailles with Queen Marie Antoinette, oblivious to the fury in the streets. The middle class was exhausted by injustice. The Enlightenment philosophers declared that liberty and equality were the natural rights of every human being. On July 14, 1789, the spark was struck. The people of Paris stormed the Bastille, the symbol of royal tyranny, the prison where the king's enemies were held. Its walls came down. The revolution had begun. The years after 1789 were among the bloodiest and most complex Paris had ever known. The revolutionaries arrested the king. They put him on trial, and in 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde. Marie Antoinette followed a few months later. The guillotine fell hundreds of times in Paris. The period called the Reign of Terror devoured even many of the revolutionaries themselves. But from within all that blood and chaos, ideas emerged that changed the course of human history forever. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the rights of man, democracy. These ideas left Paris and spread across the entire world. Out of the chaos of revolution, one man stepped forward who would shake the earth: Napoleon Bonaparte, the small Corsican general who seized power in a coup in 1799 and declared himself Emperor of France in 1804. Napoleon loved Paris and wanted to make it rival ancient Rome. He ordered the Arc de Triomphe built. He raised the Vendôme column. He carved wide boulevards through the city. He filled the Louvre with artworks gathered from across Europe. Napoleon understood that an emperor needs a magnificent capital, a city that the whole world would dream of seeing. But Napoleon's ambitions had no ceiling. He conquered half of Europe. Then Russia broke him. He came back, was defeated again, was exiled, returned, and was finally and permanently crushed at Waterloo. Paris tasted humiliation. Allied forces entered the city. But the culture and greatness of Paris, even in defeat, captivated everyone who walked its streets. By the mid-19th century, Paris was still wrestling with its narrow medieval alleys. Cholera had swept through the city several times. Napoleon III decided to rebuild Paris from the ground up. He appointed Georges-Eugène Haussmann to do it. Haussmann executed one of the boldest urban projects in history. He tore down old neighborhoods. He drove wide, sweeping boulevards through the city. Those famous tree-lined avenues that define Paris today, they are Haussmann's work. He built great parks. He constructed a modern sewer system. He brought gas lighting to the streets. Many hated what he did. Ancient neighborhoods vanished. Thousands of families were displaced. But modern Paris rose from that destruction, the Paris we know and love. 1889. 100 years had passed since the revolution. France wanted to show the world how far it had come. A World's Fair was held in Paris, and for that fair, an engineer named Gustave Eiffel proposed building a tower of iron. The people of Paris were furious at first. Writers and artists signed letters of protest. They called it ugly, jarring, a disfigurement of Paris. But the tower was built, 300 meters tall. At that moment, the tallest man-made structure on Earth. And when people climbed to the top and saw Paris spread out beneath them from that impossible height, every last one of them fell in love with it. The Eiffel Tower was meant to be demolished 20 years later, but it had become the symbol of Paris itself. No one could bring themselves to tear it down. Today, millions visit it every year. Every night, in the darkness, thousands of lights blaze across the tower. And Paris from above looks like a dream you never want to wake from. This tower that once provoked fury and contempt has received more paying visitors than any other attraction in the history of the world. The 20th century arrived with war. In the First World War, the Germans nearly took Paris. In 1914, they reached within 40 kilometers of the city, but they were stopped at the Battle of the Marne. Legend has it that the taxis of Paris transported 6,000 soldiers to the front to plug the gap in the defenses. They became known as the taxis of the Marne. In the Second World War, the story grew darker. In 1940, the Nazis occupied France. Paris surrendered. Hitler walked into the city. For 4 years, the Nazis held everything. The Jews of Paris were sent to death camps. The French resistance plotted in cellars and cafes. In August 1944, the Allies closed in. Hitler ordered Paris destroyed, the bridges blown up, the historic buildings burned. But the German commander in Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, did not carry out the order. He could not bring himself to do it. He saved Paris. And on August 25th, 1944, General de Gaulle walked through the liberated streets, and Paris wept with joy. Paris today is a city of 2 million people within its boundaries, and over 12 million across the greater metropolitan area. The capital of France, a heart of the European Union, the global capital of fashion, art, and gastronomy. More than 30 million tourists arrive every year to see the Eiffel Tower, to sit in the cafes, to stroll along the banks of the Seine, and to simply be there, to sit with a cup of coffee and watch life pass by. This is what the Parisians call the art of living, an art this city has mastered across the centuries and taught to the world. But Paris wrestles with modern challenges too: social inequality, immigration, climate change, terrorism. In November 2015, terrorist attacks in Paris killed 130 people. The city mourned, but it stood, it breathed, and it carried on, as it always has. In April 2019, the fire at Notre Dame brought the world to tears. When the cathedral's great spire collapsed, Parisians stood in the streets and wept openly. But again, Paris rebuilt. In December 2024, Notre Dame reopened. The cathedral was alive. The story continued. Paris began as a small island in the middle of a river. It began with people who understood that the water around them was their protection. 2,500 years have passed. The Romans came and went. The Vikings came and went. Revolution came. Napoleon came and went. Hitler came and went. But Paris remained and endured. And perhaps the secret of Paris's endurance is this: the city has never been just one thing, not merely a political capital, not merely a military stronghold, not merely a marketplace. Paris has always been a place where ideas come to live, where human beings arrive from every corner of the earth to find something new, to create something, to say something they could not say anywhere else. Voltaire thought here. Hugo wrote here. Picasso painted here. Hemingway learned here. This city belongs not just to the French, it belongs to anyone who has something worth saying. Today, when you cross the bridges over the Seine and look down at the water, if you listen closely, really listen, you can hear the faint and familiar voices of those first Parisii who stood before this same river 2,500 years ago and said, here is where we build our home. Paris was born in that small, human moment. And in every small human moment that unfolds in this city still, it is born again.